Good New Year, and hello and welcome to this first episode of Questions and Answers on the Culture Genie channel. Here I will answer the questions sent to me on the community post where I asked for your questions. First comment is by The Dead Warrior. What would you say is the hardest part about researching your topics? Is it the conflicting sources or the lack of them, etc.? Also, which part of Sweden do you think is the best? I will start with the thing about researching my topics. When it comes to researching my topics, it really depends upon the topic. Certain topics, especially if I'm more focused upon cultural things rather than history, there are usually a lot of sources that I can use. Though even there can be exceptions where practices are rarely written about or described. A frustrating case in both my research for these videos and also outside when I research things on a more academic level for academia is that in certain cases you know that a source exists, but you can't get to it due to various reasons. Sometimes this can be because the book or the literature that you're searching for is not found in the library, or it has been borrowed to someone else and it has stayed borrowed by someone else for several months, and the literature can't be obtained for a reasonable price or obtained at all because it is so old and has gone out of print. Sometimes it is because the archives don't want to send a photocopy of the manuscript or of the source, meaning that you must be there in person, which might not be feasible, or won't allow you access at all to the manuscript due to various reasons. You also have the issues of sources that are in languages which you don't understand. So for example, when I write about Arabic history, I will use Arabic sources, but there is a lot of sources in other languages which I am not proficient in. For example, Greek or Persian, which I could use if I knew the languages. Being able to read sources or getting sources is a question about time, effort, feasibility to get sources, and skills such as learning a language. And all of these things require resources and time, which are not always possible for me to or others to provide. But I would say that generally, when it comes to the difficulty of researching a topic, it depends very much upon the topic. What is the hardest part? With that said, it is true that it can be a very hard part to decide which sources to trust when you do find contradictory sources. Though the hardest part generally for me is to limit myself when it comes to my research for my videos. Because when you're in the process of researching things, it's very easy to just make it expand to include more and more. You want more and more sources, you want more and more information. But you're also going to have to limit yourself in the end to just some information in order to make a coherent video that talks about the most important parts. Or when you're writing a paper, for example, you always have to limit yourself because any topic could expand to almost include anything. And this also goes beyond just sources. It also includes the analysis stage, when you need to decide what type of analysis you are going to use or which ones. Because you can look at a lot of sources in a lot of different ways, which means that there is a lot more analysis you could do to a lot of the topics in my videos. And also when you're in the process of researching a topic for a video or for other types of research, for example for academia, you will come across a lot of other interesting things that you suddenly also get the want to make videos about or to discuss. However, here you kind of need to still stay on target, to stay disciplined and focused upon the current task, to stay confined within the limits you have set upon yourself. And you also need to consider those limits yourself, because just showing parts of something can, or rather will, affect the end product or the history or the topic you're discussing in your video. and the interpretation of it. So you have to also consider what will happen if I don't mention this as well. And will not mentioning this distort the view of this topic, the subject discussed? Can I omit this and not cause issues? Or do I need to include it, but it would not be good to include it in this video? If that is the case, I will be forced to make a video about it before I release this video, if I've stumbled upon such a thing. You also need to consider when you're making videos the audience. Because if you begin to discuss a lot of very obscure historical facts or historical theories or historical arguments that are very limited to certain fields or types of studies and not known in the general public, then people will not understand what you are trying to present in your video. So you also need to limit yourself with regard to those things as well, and only include information that can be easily understood by the audience. Or if it cannot be easily understood but is vital to be understood, you need to consider how you should present these things and what limitations you have to do elsewhere in order to keep the video watchable. You always have these considerations about limitations and focus when it comes to your topics in the videos. And these are actually very hard considerations. This is arguably the hardest reoccurring part of researching a topic. As for when it comes to my favorite part of Sweden, this is a tricky question to answer, but that would probably be the region of Dalarna in the middle of Sweden. It is also a very beautiful region with deep forests, lots of lakes and mountains, though there exist a lot of other very beautiful regions in Sweden with a lot of very specific regional cultures that are very interesting. I have lived and grown up in a lot of various regions in Sweden. So this is not me really dissing the other regions, it's just my personal preference for Dalarna. And discussing the regions of Sweden, I might actually in the future make a video about the various regions in Sweden, where I will discuss some of the nature and culture and stereotypes associated with them in Swedish culture. The Dead Warrior, I thank you for these questions. Now moving on to the next question. By Mau Kill Me. Is Zeihan right about China's imminent collapse? For some context here, Peter Zeihan has this theory that China, due to being dependent upon international trade and thus dependent upon the shipping security and mutual trade provided by the United States, which will go away in the future according to Peter Zeihan, together with the fact that China has a declining population due to low birth rates and low replacement rates, will collapse, or at least suffer enormous problems. That the Chinese state is in not a good position to rectify due to various reasons. I would say that Peter Zeihan's predictions, insofar that they are correct in that China will face huge issues in the future. However, I'm unsure if this will lead to the collapse of China or even the collapse of the current regime. It might do. But the issue with these sorts of predictions are that there are a lot of factors that could change, and especially change due to human involvement. Because if things are beginning to go badly, then people will react to that and try to change course. And I have heard some counter-arguments to Peter Zeihan that points towards the possibility of China actually managing to get through these problems due to various possibilities available to them. Even if a lot of these possibilities would be rather extreme measures. This is not me making a moral argument, this is me describing how the Chinese might deal with this. There are still things that are available to them, such as enormous birthing programs and discarding the help of the elderly, or even outright getting rid of them, which could help with the demographic issue, because old people being a drain on society is only the case when you actually allow them to be a drain on society. The issue here is that that might not be liked by people, which could lead to revolution and collapse, but it might also not lead to that. And when it comes to the economic trade issues, I can see actually that China has kind of the ability to protect the sea lanes by increasing their fleet power, which they are already doing. You also have a lot of emerging markets around the world that they could trade with, which could dampen the effect of closed trade with the United States to a certain degree. Will these things be enough to prevent what Peter Zeihan has predicted? Perhaps, perhaps not. We will have to see, because the future is hard to predict. But still, I do think that Peter Zeihan makes a pretty good case for his prediction. Even if it is not an imminent collapse, China will face problems that they will have to solve. Alright, the second question from Mao Kilmi. What do you think about Ayn Rand's objectivism? Tackling Ayn Rand's philosophy is a very broad thing that would need its own video. But if I was to describe my issues with the philosophy of Ayn Rand, it is less to do with her conclusions, which I disagree with, but that's not the important part. And it has more to do with how she argues from her fundamental assumptions. I think there is an issue of her going from is to ought without any deeper reflection. It becomes kind of an issue of a non sequitur in her philosophy. And this, I think, is a bigger issue than just me disagreeing with her assumptions or her conclusions. I might not agree with right-wing, individualist, free market capitalist philosophies that much. But I think, for example, that Murray Rothbard or Frederick Bastei or most of the proponents of the Austrian School of Economics and several other anarcho-capitalist philosophers and other philosophers that are close to that sort of thought have had better, more coherent systems for arguing what they wanted or what they saw. And even though I may personally disagree with all of these philosophies and thinkers, I do it mostly on the basis of the axiomatic principles that they adopt, rather than seeing issues with the internal structure of their arguments, which I would argue is a problem with the philosophy of objectivism as presented by Ayn Rand, though later followers of that philosophy have done some changes which makes it more coherent. And now for the last question. What is the future of Europe? I asked for a specification with regards to this, and you gave me that it is about the geopolitical and economical future of Europe. Again, this is a huge question that deserves its own video if I ever make one about it. But in order to give a rather reductionist answer to this, I would say that in the immediate future I don't think that much will change in Europe, as the recent Russian expansionism has actually made Europe a lot more unified again, if you consider Europe and the EU here as the same thing. However, it will have to be seen in the future if the EU can remain as it does right now, or if it will consolidate further, or if it will begin to dissolve, and Europe will become, as it has been in the past, and even is today, more of a patchwork of various political entities, and not a kind of united Europe. This also goes into the economics part of your question. Europe is very diverse, with a lot of very different countries with very different economics and economical systems within these countries that in turn are governed by very different political systems. The enormous diversity found here in Europe when it comes to these things makes it so that you can't just say that Europe as a whole is something. Instead, you need to talk about individual countries, as various countries will have very different issues facing them and very different opportunities to improve themselves. This could be argued to be both a strength and a weakness of the European economical system. The strength is that I don't see a total collapse of Europe as all the various systems collapsing. In fact, I think that if various parts of Europe begin to collapse, then you do have the advantage in Europe that you have other systems that can take over and take a bit of the burden and be used as springboards for restoring other parts of Europe. However, this diversity of both politics and of economical systems also means that some parts of Europe will almost always be in trouble due to various reasons. And when times generally are getting tougher, they will suffer more. But on the other hand, I think that total systemic collapses are going to be rare, if non-existent, in the future, due to the diversity and extremely divided nature of Europe, which prevents economic chain collapses. With that said, this extremely diverse nature of Europe is also the reason as to why the EU struggles so much in unifying the EU. Europe is naturally predisposed to being fractured and being a region in constant conflict. I actually made a video about this earlier in the year 2022. And it is possible that a future of Europe is that we will go back into a state of more war, more conflicts between various parts of Europe, as Europe is still pretty divided, as it has always been divided in a lot of smaller entities, with a lot of struggles between these various entities that just lie buried due to current political considerations. But it is possible that these conflicts could reignite due to political and economical reasons. However, I see this probably happening not in the near future, but further along the line, in the next half of this century at the earliest. The only exception to this probably being the Balkan region. But even then, with the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia and the heavy involvement of several large European states and the USA, I don't think it will turn into a large-scale conflict with any intervention from other players that will quickly crush any conflict in the area. And Russia, which could probably get involved in the Balkans, is too bound up in Ukraine to expend the resources necessary to create a large-scale conflict there, if the other European countries quickly react to any crisis in the Balkan region in order to smother it before it becomes a large-scale conflict. These are my abbreviated thoughts about how Europe is going to develop, or might develop. Predicting the future is hard. And sure, I would say that history can give you the tools to predict some things in the future, but there is still a lot of things that are unknown or could change rapidly, due to factors and reasons that you can't predict easily. Though I still thank you for these questions, even if they are a bit outside of my direct expertise. It's still fun to answer these questions and to discuss them. And this goes just generally for any comment or question on my videos or channel generally. I'm very thankful for your engagement with this channel. And this marks the end of this Q&A. The next Q&A that I will do will either be at the end of next year, the end of 2023, or when I have passed 1,000 subscribers. That is, if not something special happens. Or I just decide to add one, due to changing my mind.